All right, welcome back, my APUSH kiddies. So we have chapter 16. We are finally past the Civil War. We're finally done talking about slavery, I know. So that brings with it many loose ends we need to tie up that kind of were broken up by the Civil War. The Civil War is kind of like a point in our history that cuts a lot of movements in half. The Industrial Revolution, westward expansion, the story about Native Americans, immigration. There's many different things that occur in our country's history that are broken up by the Civil War. So, as mentioned, one of those movements or ideas that we've been talking about all the way back in chapter 13 and really all the way back to the beginning of the year was westward expansion, right? We're talking about manifest destiny, and we've introduced this a long time ago. Westward expansion doesn't stop at the Civil War. Just because we've made it to California, the Compromise of 1850, and admitting California as a state, doesn't mean we're done. So what's going on with westward expansion since then? Since the gold rush in California, since the Mormons, and since the settlers up to Oregon country, the federal government says, okay, there's a lot of land that's in the middle of the country that people are just kind of passing over. And they don't know it yet, but the Great Plains are actually going to become very valuable to our country. So westward expansion, maybe we're not going all the way west to California anymore, but the government is going to say, hey, listen, what about middle America here? And they're going to pass a couple of laws to try to get people to move to the Great Plains. The Homestead Act being one of them. Now, we briefly mentioned the Homestead Act during the Civil War chapter, chapter 14, because we said when the Republican Congress was in session, right, the Democrats had withdrawn because of the Civil War, the Southern Democrats that were, the Republican-dominated Congress, they had the ability to really pass a lot of laws without, a lot of opposition. So the Homestead Act being one of them in 1862, right in the middle of the Civil War, this said, hey, listen, the federal government wants people to head out to middle America. They're going to give land away, essentially. 160 acres to any person that wants to live on this land and make it, livable, if you will. You have 5 years to do it. So this is a big deal. 160 acres is a lot of land, and this is going to encourage a lot of people to head out there. Now, sounds great. Sometimes it was great. Sometimes it was not great. Okay, there were difficulties and limitations. Sometimes the quality of land was not good. Okay, you couldn't exactly farm on all of the land. Sometimes you had great land, but you don't have money to, or supplies to essentially cultivate the land, which is a problem. Sometimes Mother Nature didn't work out. We have droughts. We have, some weather conditions that are going to, really damper a lot of people's success in the Great Plains, tornadoes, for example. Fraud. We're going to talk more about that with the railroad and those railroad companies coming up in the next few weeks. But yes, a lot of people are going to be ripped off, okay, with their land, as we'll see with the railroad. Fluctuating crop prices. That just has to do with supply and demand, okay? Does Europe want our stuff? Does the East want the stuff? Do they not? What's going on? And that always is fluctuating every now and then. So the Homestead Act is a big incentive for people to move out there. Now, a way for people to move out there would be the railroad. And the Pacific Railroad Act of 1862, again, same year, right in the middle of the Civil War. Remember, the North was all about the railroad. They want to connect the country. And that bottom map there on the slide to the right, all of those black lines, okay, were the railroads that existed, okay, before 1862. And then after the Pacific Railroad Act, the red lines are all the railroads that are built afterwards, a lot of them down south and a lot of them heading westward. So the federal government wants to give subsidies or essentially land to the railroad company to keep building more and more tracks. At a certain point, they were almost building tracks to nowhere, and eventually that's going to come back to bite them. But for now, okay, the Transcontinental Railroad is going to be built and really completed by 1869. The entire country, east to west, at what's called Promontory Point, will be connected, all right, which is a big deal for numerous reasons: transportation, soldiers, goods, etc. So how do you make money out in the West? Okay, yeah, I could farm, okay, but there are other ways to make money. There are some mines out there, okay, other than California and the Gold Strike. We have Colorado, Pikes Peak, Comstock Lode in Nevada. Those are some people, or some areas I should say, that people head to, just like California in 1849, to strike it rich. Some successful and some not so much. Very dangerous conditions. Being a miner comes with it a lot of workplace tragedies and workplace safety protocols. A big part of mining is using TNT, okay, dynamite, to essentially blow up mountains and things like that to find gold, which obviously it could be very dangerous working with that material. Environmental destruction. So as we use or start to use more machines to mine, that's going to hurt the environment, and a lot of people are going to be not okay with that. We'll talk more about the conservation movement in the next few weeks. That's towards the latter half of the 1800s. But we also have to remember, whose land are these people moving out to, right? We keep pushing the Native Americans out west, out west. Well, now we've reached out west. We gave them a bunch of land in the Great Plains area that said, okay, this is yours, we're not going to touch it. Well, obviously, we are going to start to take that land as well. Other ways to make money, the cattle industry. Cattle are roaming in that Great Plains area as well. A lot of vaqueros, or Mexican cowboys, have been settling in this area for a while, since Texas. There's a lot of grasslands. The railroads are going to kind of screw that up, because they're going to divide a lot of people's land. They're also going to divide the areas where cattle can go. The cattle are, you don't want them in front of a train. That's not going to be good. So there's going to be a lot of issues with that. And the farmers are really going to experience some bad times. We'll talk more about their movement and more about their fight in these next few weeks. Okay, so the West, there's a big romanticized view of the West, and if we were to rewind a little bit back to like the 1950s, 60s, 70s, the West was this romantic view, this idea of cowboys versus Indians, and there's always that fight for the good against the Native Americans, and a lot of that's true, but also not true. Okay, the romanticized view of the West, the wild, wild West, go out there and you have a crazy time, and, there's a lot of wealth to be had. Not exactly true for everybody. There's a big diverse group out there, which is interesting. We always think of cities being a very diverse place, but actually the American West was very diverse. We do have white Americans. We will see Native Americans. We're going to see a lot of immigrants, okay? A lot of Asian immigrants, particularly the Chinese, going out in the West, okay? Because for two reasons. One, the gold rush, but also working on the railroad, okay? And a lot of Chinese immigrants worked on the railroad to finish that transcontinental railroad. We're going to see African Americans, after slavery is over, head out to the West to find their own land. Those Mexican cowboys we mentioned. We have the Mormons out in Utah. And as far as women, believe it or not, women experience the most rights, okay, out in the West, because out in the West, on the frontier, it takes everybody to survive. It doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. Everybody has to pitch in to survive, and you're actually going to see a lot more rights given to women on the frontier out in the West. In particular, women's suffrage. We see Wyoming, for example, the first state to grant women's suffrage before we have that national amendment, the 19th Amendment, okay, that we'll talk about after the Progressive Era. But for now, okay, women are experiencing a lot more rights out in the West than they are back in the East. Now, speaking about that trans-Mississippi West, that Great Plains region I mentioned earlier, there's some animals, like the cattle. There's also buffalo. The buffalo were native to North America, and the buffalo were a huge part of the Native American life during the early years, and even right now, where we're at in the mid-1800s. The problem is, in 1800, there were 15 million buffalo roaming wild in North America, the modern-day United States. 70 years later, there's 1,000 left. That's a big difference, okay? What happens to all those buffalo? Do they run away? No, they're killed by the white Americans. One, okay, for food. Two, for their hide, okay, to make clothing and to keep warm, blankets, stuff like that for our frontiersmen. 3, believe it or not, sometimes they were just killed because they were near railroad tracks and they didn't want them by the railroad tracks, and so they were just killed for the sake of killing. And 4, even more horrible, is a lot of times white Americans did kill them because it undermines Native American religion. And so that's not cool. So we do see the bison, the buffalo really die out, almost become completely extinct from the continent. Thankfully, okay, since 1870, there are way more buffalo in the United States. We have, as you can see there, in 1996, we have about 200,000. We have more than that today, but still nowhere near 15 million bison from 1800. So we have a huge negative effect or impact on the population there of the bison. So that's really sad. What else? Speaking about the railroad, okay, we talked about that map earlier. Okay, a lot of land was given to railroad companies, which we're going to find out was a little bit of a mistake. When the government gives the railroad companies this land to build railroads, it's a little bit of a mistake because they're giving them power. And as we get into the what's called the Gilded Age and later on the Progressive Era, we're going to find out that these tycoons, these monopolies, the railroad being one of them, is going to have a lot of power, and the government really assisted them in giving them that power. Okay, but we'll talk more about them later on. Another thing, consolidation of that land leads to standardization of the industries. So the railroad, the building of the railroad is going to help other industries like the steel industry. But again, we'll talk more about that with the Gilded Age. So, age of the railroads happens at the same time the settlement of the Great Plains. Like we said, that does allow a lot of people to move out to the Great Plains region. Transcontinental Railroad, that Pacific Railroad Act in 1862, we said it's going to be finished by 1869. You're basically going to have 2 crews working on the railroad, one in the west and one in the east, and they're going to be working on building the rail, okay, towards each other. So the Union Pacific Railway is going to be built from Omaha, Nebraska to the west, and then the opposite, the Central Pacific, is built from California, Sacramento to Sierra Nevada. They both meet, as I mentioned earlier, at Promontory Point. You can see this on the map right here. They both build towards each other, and finally the last pike is put in. That's what this picture is right here, Promontory Points, and the 2 railroad tracks are meeting. The continent is finally connected, if you will, with one transcontinental railroad. And that's obviously a huge deal. As far as the impact of the railroad, I mentioned earlier, huge effect on trade. You're basically making the country smaller in the sense that we are able to trade things from east to west and vice versa. Mass distribution of raw materials and manufactured goods. So the price of goods will also go down because it takes less time to get there. This is going to encourage mass production, mass consumption, which is what kind of society we live in today. Helps promote the growth of other industries, as mentioned earlier, the coal, steel industry. We'll talk more about them in the next few weeks. And also facilitates immigration internally and externally. Okay, as mentioned earlier as well, the Chinese immigrants are going to be a big part of building the railroad. But you're going to see some other immigrants, like some Germans, head out to the west in hopes of buying and getting land as well. Believe it or not, another impact of the railroad is that we have, for the first time, we're going to have to create time zones. We've never had time zones before the railroads. What the reason is because with railroad times, okay, 3 o'clock in New York is very different than 3 o'clock, in California. And so they have to adjust, those times to have everybody in sunlight or daylight. So we do create the time zones because of train times, okay, essentially. And as you can see on the map here, there's our Eastern, Central, Mountain, and Pacific times, and then Alaska and Hawaii have their own times as well. So time zones were created because of the railroad. Interesting. What else? The problem with the railroads, we talked about all the positives, but I did mention these tycoons that are about to be, born because of all the power given to the railroads. All of this land given to the railroads by the government is going to create a giant monster, essentially. And if you've ever played the game of Monopoly, there's a reason that, if you control the railroads in that game, you're at a huge advantage, okay? Railroads were purposely put into that game because they were America's first real monopoly. And again, we'll talk more about that means later on, but they're our first major monopoly, and they have a lot of power. So the problem is they become so powerful that they do start, like I talked about, overbuilding in some places. They're mismanaged. There's a lot of fraud plaguing the industry, okay, giving land and money to certain business owners. So, for example, you would think if you know what a rebate is or a discount, obviously, everybody wants a discount. Everybody wants a rebate, okay? If I buy a $1,000 TV, I want a rebate of $100. That means I get $100 back. Of course, I want that. Do I need that? Do I need that rebate, or does Bill Gates or Elon Musk? Okay, do the rich guys of today, do they need those rebates or discounts? No way. I'm the small guy. Okay, I'm the guy that doesn't have all the wealth in the world. I need the rebate, the discount. And sometimes the railroads, most of the time I should say, the railroads were giving those rebates or discounts to those big time producers, and they were ignoring the small farmers. The small farmers who really needed those rebates and discounts were actually charged much higher rates, which is not cool. All right, and that's going to create a problem and a big movement, okay, with the farmers later on. Pools. A pool is a type of monopoly. They're basically secret agreements between companies to fix rates and share profits. So an example of a pool, imagine AT&T and Verizon secretly come up with a deal to say, okay, we're going to raise our rates next week by $100. That's a pool. That's illegal today. Back during this time, not illegal. Okay, wait till we get to the progressive era. So speaking about heading out west, I did mention, that we do have the issue of the Native Americans who are still out there, and we're taking their land, and we're going to have some more conflicts, really the last of our conflicts with the Native Americans. We've had conflicts with the Native Americans since we came here from Europe. We continue to do so through the 17 and 1800s, and it's really going to stop after this. So a couple of things to, pay mind to: the Sand Creek Massacre. This was during the Civil War. This is basically a slaughter of 100 Native American people in Colorado. And when I say 100 Native American people, mostly women and children. That's not cool. That's not good. But unfortunately, we are responsible for that. Fast forward a little bit further, Battle of Little Bighorn, the Sioux tribe, which is one of the more destructive and powerful tribes out in the West. They actually do get a big win. They kill a Civil War veteran, General Custer, also referred to as Custer's Last Stand. And, huge win for the Native Americans, but very short-lived because they're going to wind up losing and getting squashed by the Americans not too long afterwards. Okay, so they get redemption for that big win. Chief Joseph attempts to lead members of the Nez Perce tribe in Canada to basically run away from us. We do catch them, and like I said before, we kill them. Not cool. One of the last things they do, the Native Americans, that is, with the 1800s, is they have this ghost dance movement. And this ghost dance movement consisted of this dance that they would do to try to bring back, one, the buffalo that were killed by the white man, and also to try to bring their ancestors who have died to help them in this fight against the white man. We couldn't just let them have this little dance themselves as ritual. And so at the Battle of Wounded Knee, the white Americans had to squash this ghost dance movement. And this is like I say, squash it, we're going to kill them and slaughter them. Over 200 Native Americans are killed. And it was really a massacre, not even a battle. This is our last resistance by the Native Americans. After this, okay, we're not really going to see too much Native American resistance, which is a shame. So what do we do with the Native Americans then? We actually are trying to force them to assimilate. So assimilation, if you know what that means, it means to kind of, make part of, in this case, to make American. And, what do we do with the Native Americans now that we're, done fighting them? We're going to try to force them to become, quote unquote, American. And Helen Hunt Jackson, this lady on the slide right here, she documents all this mistreatment by the Native Americans throughout our history. And, one of the things we do, in her book, I should say, A Century of Dishonor, is how horrible we've treated them. And to continue that idea of how horrible we treat them, we're going to tell them that their way of life is not acceptable. We are going to set up Carlisle Indian schools, for example, where we are going to force these Native American children to go to these American schools to learn English, to cut their hair and change their names and be more American. Not very successful. The Dawes Severalty Act is a piece of legislation in 1887 that actually ends tribal ownership of land, says they're not allowed to do this anymore. They're not allowed to have their own reservation land, even though we gave it to them. So we split up reservations, we make them into smaller pieces, we tell the Native Americans, hey, listen, you really need to be an American citizen. The Native Americans say, okay, what do we need to do to be an American citizen? They say, here's what you got to do. Change your names, lose your religion, cut your hair, speak English, and send your kids to those American schools. And the Native Americans are like, no. Okay, why are we going to do all that just to be an American citizen? There's no benefit to them to being an American citizen. And so the Native Americans are going to really suffer from the Dawes Act. And these, Indian schools, one example, like I said before, the Carlisle Indian School, they're really going to suffer from this, and it's going to lead to their downfall. To this day, okay, 2020, we're going to see a lot of Native Americans suffer and be amongst the most poorest of Americans today. So their story doesn't really improve too much. But in a couple of months, we'll talk about the Indians and Native Americans, what happens to them later in the 1900s. So destroying their life, okay, disease has destroyed their life since we became, since we came here. We talked about numerous wars and all throughout the different centuries. The decline of the bison, the buffalo population, and the failed treaty agreements have really just led to the destruction of the Native Americans. And it's a very sad part of our history, and really a neglected part of our history, in fact, in which we've really done to them. Okay, the last part of the chapter discusses this guy, Frederick Jackson Turner. Frederick Jackson Turner was a historian. He writes a book, The Significance of the Frontier in American History. The thesis, the idea of Frederick Jackson Turner that we must know is that he says the frontier that we've been chasing since we were the 13 colonies, by 1890, it's closed, it's done, it's over. It's interesting. Okay, he emphasizes the importance of the frontier on our identity, saying, "Hey, listen, it was always part of our history that we have always been able to go westward, but we did it. We're done." People had this safety valve theory, this idea that if they were unsuccessful in the east, they just keep moving west until they become successful. And a lot of families are going to do that. Some successful, some aren't. But what's interesting, though, is he ignores the contributions of people that were already in the frontier out west, like women and Native Americans, for example. He also ignored the fact that the reason people weren't really heading out west past 1890 wasn't because the frontier was closed. It was because the Industrial Revolution was taking off, the Second Industrial Revolution, that is, and people were moving to urban areas, those cities, because that's where the jobs were. All right. He also cannot foresee the future of imperialism, which imperialism will be another example of manifest destiny. So Frederick Jackson Turner, your thesis is a little flawed. Although the frontier is closed, there's still more frontier to be had, and you also didn't look at the bigger picture, why people stopped moving westward. So that's who Frederick Jackson Turner is. Finally, the farmers, and we're going to talk more about this. This wasn't exactly all in your reading just yet. But it will be in the next few weeks. The farmers, the poor farmers who have been being taken advantage of by the railroads, the falling prices of crops, the high tariffs the farmers have to pay, the tight money supply, the high cost of machinery. This is going to lead to the farmers organizing and creating what's called the Grange movement. It's the Grangers, they're the farmers. They want the government to step in and help them. Now, the government in 1877, they actually will have a Supreme Court case called Munn versus Illinois, where the government said actually states would regulate railroads. That's not a good idea because each state regulating their own railroad, kind of like when the Articles of Confederation had oversaw interstate commerce trade, didn't work out when you had the states having control. You need the federal government to step in. So the Munn versus Illinois case actually is overturned not too long afterwards by the Wabash case. That creates the Interstate Commerce Act. We'll talk more about that in the future, but essentially the government has control of the railroads and their interstate commerce, which was a big win for the farmers, but it'll take a little while to kick in. We'll talk more about that in later weeks. As far as the farmers, they will create a third party called the Populist Party, and the Populist Party, they're about the farmers wanting the government to own the railroads, to take control of them, to help them out, to increase the amount of money in supply, to create an income tax where the rich pay more, and directly elect senators. Again, a lot of stuff on there we'll talk more about in the future, and you'll read more about in your textbook, but essentially the Populist Party, although they're insignificant in the beginning, their ideas will become very popular during the Progressive era and eventually actually even adopted by the other two major political parties. Closing out the 19th century, there's a lot of issues with laissez-faire capitalism, which we're going to see and find out in the next few weeks. The Homestead Act was great, and that's going to allow people to move out west, okay, but it's going to cause a lot of issues. We are going to have some economic downfalls. We're going to have some what's called the Homestead Strike, but we'll talk more about that. The laissez-faire approach is going to lead to a lot of people being taken advantage of in the cities, and it's going to actually cause something called the Progressive Era, which we'll talk more about coming up. All right, so I'm going to skip some of this stuff, but we will talk more in depth about some of these guys and some of these places and people and groups later on. So for now, that's the end of our chapter. Hopefully this helped, and if you liked it, if you think it helped, give it a like or subscribe. Other than that, have a wonderful rest of your day.